What is up, everybody? Welcome back. Hope you're all having a great day today. I am joined today by my special guest, John. John, would you like to introduce yourself? He's with the Iowa Hawkeyes. He does reporting up in Iowa City. We're just giving you guys another off-season breakdown today. We've done a bunch of school so far, and today we get to talk about some Hawkeyes action. John, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm John Steppe. I'm the Iowa football beat writer for the Cedar Rapids Gazette newspaper. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course, and a big thank you for coming on. It means a lot to have you here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, without further ado, we'll get right into it. Don't want to drag on any intros too long. There's been a lot of news specifically around this Iowa team lately after the whole situation goes down with offensive tackle Kadyn Proctor. Of course, this is a long saga. It's not even just these past 2 months. Going back to 2023, he originally commits to go to the Hawkeyes. He's from Iowa, flips to Alabama, and while that sucks, that part of the whole thing is kind of normal, right? We see recruits flip all the time. It happens. Then the saga really heats up when in January he enters the transfer portal, commits to Iowa again, has them basically rat on themselves or fess up for a tampering charge, and then 2 months later he's gone. Doesn't even step foot on the practice field. I don't even know if he did winter conditioning. You'd be able to correct me there. So he basically does nothing for the team. Collects an NIL check, and I saw someone from the Swarm say that they didn't take it from them. It was no fan funding; it was more corporate sponsors. But he takes NIL funding from corporate sponsors, is there for 2 months, and now he leaves and goes back to Bama before the portal even opens, in a move that I can only assume must have some tampering behind it. But I'm not gonna throw any accusations out there. And this whole thing is it's a big debacle, and it really just sheds light on the mess that the transfer portal is right now. And I don't even want to go into all that, but can you just kind of give us some details about what the process of originally getting him to come back was like, and then what kind of went down that prompted him to leave?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting 59 days. 59 days is how long he is a Hawkeye.
Not even a full 2 months.
No, January 20th was when he committed to Iowa, and March 19th was when he told the team that he plans to leave. So to kind of start with January, obviously Nick Saban leaves Alabama. Kadyn Proctor enters the portal. A few days later, and as soon as he entered the portal, there's a lot of fundraising momentum for Iowa's NIL collective, the Swarm Collective. They raised more than $100,000 in one day alone, which maybe for some SEC schools isn't that big of a deal, but for Iowa, that was a really big deal.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, that's a lot of money, especially in one day. So fans were really excited about this possibility. He commits on that Saturday, and you are referencing the tampering or the impermissible contact.
Right. And it wasn't anything major, but Kadyn was the one who kind of initiated the process of them having to own up to it. I don't think it would have come out if he hadn't. I think he accidentally said something during an interview. It was something like that.
Yeah, so it was kind of along the lines, and I don't have this right in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing, but is Iowa football's recruiting director, Tyler Barnes, sending a message kind of along the lines of, hey, keep your head up, because he's having a few rough games at the beginning, starting in the SEC, no surprise there. So so he sends that message. That was the extent of it. Kadyn mentions that in the interview with the TV station, and Iowa then has to self-report a level 3 violation. So it's not a huge deal. We're not talking about
I don't think anything major came out of it.
Yeah. But they self-report that violation for an impermissible contact. And then, so that happened probably, let's see if I can remember off the top of my head. I think that's probably around February, early February-ish that they were in the process of doing that. And then fast forward to March, and on Tuesday of this, I think it was, Tuesday of this week, the day before spring practices were to begin. So he did not have a single spring practice as a Hawkeye. Day before, he informs the team of his plans to leave, and all signs pointing toward that being Alabama. And here we are now. He took, as you mentioned, he did not take any money from the nonprofit wing of Swarm.
Right.
But Swarm has kind of two branches. They have the collective side, the nonprofit side, That's the side where you have the fans with the $20 a month memberships that go into that. And then you have the corporate side. And that is, okay, working with such and such auto group or whoever in terms of sponsoring these athletes. And Kadyn did take some income from the Swarm Inc. side of things. And we'll see if there's any way for them to get any of that money back. It's unlikely. He already did the promotion work for that. In the grand scheme of things, it's not like Iowa's entire NIL war chest went to this. The founder of the collective said in a radio interview that it's about 15% of what his income was going to be over the course of a year that he had received. So you're not talking about losing the whole NIL war chest, but it's enough to, especially after he flipped as a high school recruit too, enough to certainly
I don't know if he's
leave.
welcome back in that state anytime soon.
Yeah, and he's from this state too, so
Which
he's
makes
not
it even
exactly
worse.
the most popular person around here.
Yeah. And it sucks to see, especially just from a pure football side of thing, talking about developing the O-lines and developing tight ends. Who does that better than Iowa, it feels like, in these past few years? So just from a pure football perspective, it felt like it could have been a big win-win for both sides. But this kind of just speaks to the broader landscape that we're in right now. And I know a lot of people aren't happy with that. I'm personally not happy with where the transfer portal is at. But when we do look at it as a whole, do you think there should be repercussions for players transferring?
It's a difficult thing to say because the NCAA keeps on losing in court whenever they do try to implement any restrictions. I think what we're probably eventually going to see is athletes at some point becoming employees. That's something that I know scares a lot of collegiate administrators out there. But I think that's probably the only way that you can prevent this type of scenario from happening. This could happen. This happened at Iowa here. It could happen anywhere else too. You have right now
And I'm sure it will when the spring window opens up. I'm sure we will get a lot of chaos from stuff like this.
So the difficult thing is really it's a hard thing to enforce. Whatever you do, the NCAA, every time that they've tried to enforce anything, they've run into court issues. So eventually we're probably going to get to a point, as much as collegiate administrators, as long as, or I should say, as much as many collegiate administrators, not all, as much as they aren't crazy about this word, the only true way of probably resolving this and avoiding this is to reach a point where athletes become employees. And again, not necessarily the most popular thing among the full NCAA constituency, but we're going to continue to see situations like this as long as we have this kind of patchwork of NIL rules, or more like lack of rules, right now in this current fluid college sports environment.
Yeah, and it's just tough because we just keep moving in this direction of putting the players on contracts, or it just feels like it's moving in such an extreme direction, when if we could just keep rules like having to sit out for a year when you transfer multiple times as an undergrad, just keep some of the rules that were in place and simply just build upon them a little bit, just edit them instead of tearing it all down and throwing it all in this extremist direction. I fail to understand why this is the path that they have to go down when it feels like there's a lot easier changes. But I don't know. Do you think that those would be viable options, or is this just the way it has to go at this point?
I think this is pretty much kind of the way that it has to go at this point. If you all of a sudden have athletes as employees, then you can have contracts where it's for a set amount of time. But really, for a long time in college sports, the institutions really had all the power. And now we're seeing it shift kind of way in the other direction now, where
Maybe too
athletes
far in the
now
other
have pretty
direction.
much all the power. So it'll be a difficult thing in terms of how to get it kind of right, and balanced kind of in the middle. What is balance? What does that look like? We'll see. But I would guess employee status is what it's going to take, but we'll see. There are people a lot smarter than me who are trying to figure this whole thing out.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see where they go from there. As far as Iowa specifically goes, when that spring portal comes around, this is a team that historically isn't active in the portal and barely even on the recruiting trail, honestly. But should we expect maybe to see them fill any holes on their roster in this spring portal?
The challenge right now is their scholarship situation. They're over the
Yeah, that's a
scholarship
lot of
limit.
teams. Yeah.
Yeah. Now they're a little less over the scholarship limit now that Kadyn Proctor is gone, or soon to be gone, I should say. It is important
Right.
to keep in mind that he can't enter the portal officially until April 16th. So
Yeah.
could he change his mind? We'll see. But going back to your original question with kind of spring portal window, you need to first get down a little more on scholarships. They had a lot of players who had the option to use a COVID year this year, and you would have expected some of them to stay, and then almost all of them stayed.
Right.
So they really had a remarkable job retaining talent that was either
Yeah, I was gonna
considering
say it
using
feels
an
like a
extra
lot of the
COVID
high-end
year.
talent stayed for another year.
Yeah. So you have guys like Jay Higgins, Nick Jackson. Jay Higgins using a COVID year, Nick Jackson getting an NCAA waiver. You have also like Luke Lachey at tight end, somebody who could have gone to the NFL draft,
Mhm.
instead decides to stay. So you have a lot of people they kept, and because of that, they don't have as much portal flexibility as they would like. But I'm sure they're going to be keeping an eye on what's out there, especially at certain positions. Take backup
Yeah.
quarterback for an example. They have Cade
Yeah.
McNamara coming off an ACL injury. All
Right, and we'll
signs
talk about
seem
him
to
a little
be
later because
pointing.
he's an intriguing guy.
Yeah. All signs seem to be pointing toward him recovering well. I'll be curious to hear more as we get into spring press conferences. But if he gets hurt, because he has not had a fully healthy season since 2021, I think
Mhm.
everyone kind of saw what the quarterback situation is behind him, and having a little more depth there could be very helpful for Iowa. But it kind of, the scholarship numbers will be the big thing to figure
Yeah.
out how many guys go on medical, how many guys decide to transfer out, and that'll really dictate how aggressive Iowa can be. They last year found Caleb Brown in that spring portal window, and that turned out to be a very good addition. It took a while for him to get really integrated into this Iowa offense, but you look at that November month for him, and when he did finally get the ball, the numbers were pretty impressive, at least by Iowa wide receiver standards,
Right.
relatively speaking.
Yeah, and then that kind of brings us into the next thing I want to talk about. You mentioned all the players that are coming back. They did a great job of retaining talent, especially guys like Castro on the defense. Bringing back defensive players was most important because that's what was so good about this team last year, and it seems like every year they just keep bringing back good defensive players. Overall, when you look at the roster, what do you think are the main strengths and weaknesses heading into 2024?
One of the strengths I never thought would be, like, if you would have asked me in November what one of the weaknesses would have been, I would have told you linebacker. Now I would say that's one of the strengths. Really, that position really benefited from retaining talent. There was a point where you were thinking, okay, what could that position look like if you use Jay Higgins, Nick Jackson, and Kyler Fisher? Basically, your three starters. And then they retain all three. Higgins and Fisher using COVID years, Jackson using an NCAA waiver. So linebacker is certainly an area of strength. Tight end, as usual, area of strength for Iowa. Those are probably at the top of the list. Defensive line has a strong top six. Behind that, we'll see. Somebody else kind of needs to still step up.
Yeah.
Secondary, great first team. They still need to build up some depth there. In terms of weaknesses, I was mentioning the lack of depth at quarterback. That I think is a concern. If Cade McNamara cannot be his 2021 self, what's your backup plan? And wide receiver, I think, is the biggest one. That's one where you really don't have a very deep room. It's a very inexperienced, a very young room. They've struggled with retaining talent when they do come in. You look at all the guys who've transferred out of Iowa, and you'd say, okay, that's a pretty good group of wide receivers. So retaining talent has been a big issue there. I think the biggest question mark for Iowa this year is that wide receiver position.
Yeah, and I mean, it's going to rely on Cade being, like you said, his 2022, 2021 self. getting back to that peak form that he was at Michigan before, injuries and JJ McCarthy and all that stuff happened. Um, he's got to be able to elevate some guys, you think, and a running game would help. And as far as the offensive line goes, do you think that is any concern, or should they be able to protect him pretty well going into next season?
Obviously, you'd feel better if you had Kadyn Proctor. So you have
Right.
that. But despite that, it's still a pretty good group. And one of the things I was writing about this past week when Proctor entered the portal is they still have a lot of experience. They have 4 starters from last year coming back. And then they've got some experienced options for that 5th spot. So you look at it, you can keep Mason Richmond at left tackle. He is going to be a 4th-year starter, as crazy as that sounds this year. So it isn't like all of a sudden you have this huge gap at left tackle. At right tackle, you have Jennings Dunker, who I think showed spectacular progress last year. At center, you have Logan Jones, who made the switch over from defensive line to offensive line after Tyler Linderbaum went pro. And at first, there were some growing pains there, but that's gotten a lot better. And then at one guard spot, you've got Connor Colby coming back, an experienced option. And then at the other, you could see Nick DeYoung, you could see Tyler Ellsbury, you could see Bo Stevens. All of those are pretty solid options for Iowa.
Yeah, and then with Cade, do you personally have faith that he can get back to the form that Iowa fans are looking for? After an injury, he was solid. It was certainly an improvement in quarterback play in the games that he played last year. So, do you think that he can be the answer that people are looking for at that quarterback position for this year?
He's such a competitor that I'm never going to doubt him or write him off. I would say it's not a certainty. It's a question mark. I think it's possible. I wouldn't bet the house on it.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. Again, like he had a promising first couple of games, especially that Utah State game. I was like, wow, this is what a team like Iowa looks when a real quarterback is back there throwing the ball, and they were able to win. I thought, they're going to be pretty good, and it stinks. The Penn State game obviously did not go the way you would, hope it goes with a healthy quarterback, but he gets injured and he goes down. But I look at the schedule this year, and we'll talk about it more later. A healthy Cade and just 1 or 2 productive receivers, and this team could easily be 10-2, 11-1 with that Ohio State game being the only loss. But again, we'll talk about that more in a minute. New offensive coordinator this year, Tim Lester. What should we expect to change under his new offense?
That's kind of the $1,000,000 question going into spring practices. He's talked about having a lot of plays in his arsenal, and I'll be curious to see which things he decides to implement a lot. Usually we'll get a short glimpse of practice for media early on, maybe first or second week of practices, and then, or more like second or third. And then we get the last one is open to media, fans, etc. And that's going to be really interesting to see, okay, what exactly does he choose to implement? So it wasn't like in the press conference, it was like, okay, he is absolutely doing these exact things and not these things. He likes 12 personnel. I think Iowa is going to be, as long as tight end is a strength, we're going to see a lot of 12 personnel. But in terms of what else it looks like, that's still kind of the question mark here for Iowa going into spring practices. So that'll be the biggest thing that I'm going to be watching when we are able to see practice. And it'll be a question mark going, I think, even into week 1 in terms of which things, there are things that Tim Lester did a lot at Western Michigan. There are things he did at Syracuse. He's worked in a lot of different systems, and seeing which things he decides to implement the most will be one of the more interesting things. And how much different is it? Will be another really interesting question going this spring and then going into fall.
And you'd have to assume that Cade is probably the best quarterback that Lester has worked with at his 3 stops, as far as I'm aware. It sucks that he won't probably be fully cleared to start these spring practices, but it's still a lot of time before the season starts. One last question as far as the roster goes. I know the practices haven't really gotten underway yet for the media to watch, at least, but are there any players that you see on this roster, whether it's freshmen or sophomores who maybe didn't get a lot of playing time this past year? Any players do you think could be breaking out next year into maybe not stars but high end starters?
Yeah, it's a great question. You look at it, and there's room for somebody to break out at wide receiver if somebody has a really good spring. Because obviously you've got Caleb Brown. I think there's no real doubting that he's the best wide receiver right now in that room. But then you kind of look at, okay, who else is there? Seth Anderson did not have as great of a year as I think he could have had last year at Iowa. If he has a really good spring, they could really benefit from his skill set. So, wide receiver, you have room for somebody to grow. In terms of other younger players that maybe don't have a starting role this year, but maybe in 2025, Cohen Entringer in the secondary, I think, is a very talented prospect. The play that really caught everyone's attention with him was back at the Big Ten championship game when he missed the tackle on the punt coverage and then runs 80 yards or whatever it was and makes the tackle on the other end of the field. So he's somebody that's impressed coaches a lot. And right now, you don't see a first team spot for him just because you have so many people coming back. But what happens, or if you have an injury at safety, that could be potentially somebody that you could see step up into a larger role.
And safety is definitely a position of strength for them too. Right now, they return Xavier Wampa. I believe he's currently a sophomore. If I'm not wrong, he's currently a sophomore. He'll be a junior when the next season starts. He was super talented. I'm sure he'll be on draft boards when the time comes in a fairly high round. So, I mean, the kid that you're mentioning, he's got, thankfully he's got time to sit there and develop another year at least, and that should help going forward. And then you mentioned receivers. Is there any? I know you said that quarterback was a position of weakness. Is there any like freshmen coming in or anything as far as that goes that could maybe prove themselves as a viable backup?
Yeah, Iowa typically has not been the place to give true freshmen a huge opportunity. They have a talented recruit actually from Florida, James Reesar, who's coming in, and really athletic quarterback. But I don't see him contributing year one. I'm curious to see that if they don't add somebody in the portal behind Cade, what happens in terms of that QB2 spot. You have Deacon Hill, who nicest person in the world,
Right.
lovely person, great to interact with media. The numbers were not good though last
No.
year, and he knows that as well as anybody. That was rough to watch at a lot of
Yeah, to
points.
put it
And then you
nicely.
have Marco Linez, who was a true freshman last year. He got to see some time in the Citrus Bowl. Does he maybe continue to make some strides? I think Linez and Reeser could both be interesting prospects for Iowa when you're looking at who they have in that 2023 class. Was Marco, now James in 2024. Those could be some talented quarterbacks. I think there's a lot of upside there. Iowa has not done a fantastic job of developing the quarterbacks they're bringing in. But now with a new offensive coordinator who's also new quarterbacks coach, I'll be curious to see what happens there.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting. Spring ball is obviously going to be big for all these guys to kind of prove themselves, and maybe even if it's not for this year, kind of prove themselves as viable for next year. Speaking of next year, though, the 2025 recruiting trail is starting to pick up. We're seeing more commitments all the time. Iowa, they were in the top 25, which is certainly unusual for a team like that. You don't really picture them as big time recruiters. The latest update, they dropped to 27, but still a lot higher than they normally are. Currently have I believe it's 5 commits for this 2025 class, one of which is a quarterback, 3-star Jimmy Sullivan. Is there a heightened importance maybe put on the recruiting trail for this year, and is that why they picked up commitments early, or is it just they kind of realize that they have so many holes next year that they're starting to recruit a lot more and a lot earlier? What has kind of been the process behind this recruiting class?
Yeah, it's kind of looking back historically, it's pretty typical with what they do. They're never going to be having the recruiting ranking banners. They pride themselves a lot on being
Right.
a developmental program. So they aren't necessarily chasing the 4-star, 5-star guys. Right now, up to 6 commitments. So the most
6, sorry,
interesting
yeah.
of those commitments is Thomas Meyer, a tight end in-state 4-star recruit. He really could have gone anywhere. He decides to stay in-state at Iowa. certainly Iowa has a good case to make to tight end recruits. So it's kind of the same approach, though, in terms of most years for this Iowa class. In 2024, they got a really early start with some in-state recruits who committed very early on, who probably would have had higher recruiting ratings if they let their recruitment go long enough for more coaches to notice. And as a result, all of a sudden that school offers, look, there's that fourth star getting added. So that does sometimes happen. And you look at that and, okay, maybe that 2024 class would be rated higher if some of those early commits had longer recruitments. So 2025, though, by Iowa standards, off to a good start. Certainly some intriguing prospects. You mentioned getting the quarterback in the class, Jimmy Sullivan from Fort Wayne, Indiana. So they're off to a solid start here. They got quarterback taken care of. They have multiple tight end commits. That position seems to be taken care of. You have a couple linebackers. So far a strong start and kind of similar to where they've been in past years, which when you look at how they've done in recent years, that seems to have worked out well.
Yeah, and you mentioned, they're not chasing the big 4 or 5-star commits. They are currently the leading favorites. I think On3 put it at about 48%. I'm going to butcher his name, but Iose Epinesa or Espinesa. I know I butchered that, but he's ranked 46 overall on On3. The talented edge rusher. He could even be moving up, but Iowa is the favorite for him. And, every now and then we do see them kind of in the mix for, a big name lineman or a tight end. Obviously, Kadyn Proctor, for whatever it's worth, they were in the mix for that. Could we see, other than this kid, maybe they get in the mix for a big name lineman or a big name skill position player up at the top, or is there just no chance of that happening?
I'd never rule anything out. The Epinesa situation is a little bit different than most of those top-rated recruits, just because Epinesa, that is like a household name at Iowa.
Right.
You have
It's
AJ
nearby.
Epinesa, had a great career there. You have another Epinesa brother who's on the team. So Iowa has a very strong connection to the Epinesa family. So with Ios, it's a little different.
Yeah.
But we'll see. I think that's the big name to watch
Yeah.
yet in terms of who hasn't committed. It's gonna be what he does. But yeah, it's gonna be like, usually you don't see that, and there are certainly cases of Iowa landing highly rated recruits. You mentioned Kadyn Proctor this past year. Year before that, you had Xavier Wampa, was a 5-star
Yeah.
recruit, I think at least out of 2 of the
Yeah,
3
I
recruiting
couldn't see just
services.
where he was rated because everyone had him rated differently. But he was a big name recruit, and he was nearby in Iowa. He's a hometown talent.
Yeah. So if there's a connection for Iowa to go after a highly touted recruit, they'll certainly do it. They've done it at tight end. But kind of what makes Iowa unique in the recruiting world is that you can have Phil Parker, last year's Broyles Award winner. He can go in, find the 2-star recruit, and turn them into an NFL defensive back. You saw that with Riley Moss out of Ankeny, Iowa. He was very under the radar as a recruit, and now he's on the Denver Broncos. Same NFL draft class. You had Kayvon Merriweather going as an undrafted free agent to Tampa, where he's found a home there. Again, another really not highly touted recruit that Iowa has a knack for finding and getting absolutely everything out of. And that kind of is what makes them unique. And because of that, if Iowa finishes between 30th and 40th, let's say, in recruiting rankings by signing day, that's not so bad for them. Because that means they've got some talent, and they can get the most out of that talent, as they've shown at a lot of positions.
Right, and I'm sure a program like that, like you just said, isn't stressing about getting that top 25, top 30 recruiting class. They know as long as they can get, like you said, top 40, top 35, maybe in that range, and just get quality guys, they know that they can develop them because they've proven it year after year. They have the top 10, they're top 10 in the schools with the most NFL talent out there in the league currently. So yeah, it's a school with a proven development track record. So it should be interesting to see as that recruiting trail goes along. But that's kind of it as far as the recruiting goes. last thing I want to talk about today is, of course, looking forward to next season because I don't know about you, me personally, I cannot wait for this next season to get underway, whether it's 12-team playoff or just me personally, I'm a Florida State fan, so coming off a rough end of last year, I'm optimistic going into what this year can be. But everyone kind of considered this Iowa schedule last year a gift from the Big Ten gods, so to speak, and it's kind of easy when you have that division. And I saw, online there's fans who are kind of worried. No more divisions. Are we going to get stuck with Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, and Oregon all on our schedule right away? But no, you get Ohio State, and I'll pull it up here. But they did kind of get gifted a pretty good schedule going into next year. This is very winnable. You see, obviously, the spring game, but then you start with Illinois State, Iowa State rivalry. But you look at the schedule, I mean, there is a lot of winnable games here. And originally, I was worried about Washington, but they lose pretty much everybody, and I'm kind of expecting a TCU from this year's situation to happen there too. Michigan State could be interesting, but when you take a look at the schedule, and I'll scroll down so you can see the rest of it, just kind of give me where you see a floor, an actual prediction, and then what you think the ceiling could be for this team in 2024.
It's interesting because I was looking at it kind of the same way, where a couple months ago I was thinking, oh man, Ohio State, Washington, back-to-back weeks. That's not so easy. And then Washington
Right.
loses a lot, and that changes that game. So in terms of ceiling, I would say 11-1. I don't see a situation where they beat Ohio State.
Yeah,
In terms of
me neither.
floor, if the offense just goes totally off the rails, I think 8-4 would disappoint a lot of Iowa fans, but I think there's a situation
Agreed.
where you could
Yeah.
be 8-4. And then where they actually end up, I think 10-2 is realistic. I've been going back and forth between 10-2 and 9-3. Of course, this could change. We still have spring portal, still
Yeah.
a long time before the season. But I look at it as, okay, you're not going to beat Ohio State, and you have a couple, challenging games on their kind of that next tier. But,
Right.
Washington is still going to be a good team, but they're not going to be college football playoff caliber, or I should
I
say
don't think so.
14 college football playoff caliber.
Right.
So you look at that, and it's a very favorable schedule. I think it's a very realistic schedule. You look at it, Iowa State is probably going to get better than they've been these last few years, but it's still a game at Iowa, game that is going to be very winnable. I certainly could see a 3-0 non-conference this year, and then looking kind of down the road, Minnesota, that's winnable. Ohio State, no. But Washington, Michigan State, those are winnable games. Northwestern, Wisconsin, winnable games. Wisconsin really is always
Wisconsin
a
got Tyler Van
competitive.
Dyke, who I have a lot of experience with, and I'll never give Wisconsin credit as long as that man is their quarterback, because I watched him at Miami go against FSU and all those other games these past few years, and when I saw that he transferred there, I look at the schedule, I immediately flipped my pick of what I thought was going to happen.
So Wisconsin is usually a competitive series, but that's a winnable game. I think UCLA could be competitive. It could be interesting, but that's a place that's going through a coaching change. So that's winnable. And then you've got Maryland after that. I see that is very winnable. And then Nebraska ending the year. That's always a competitive series as well. I think Matt Rule is going to get that Nebraska program better than where they've been. So you can't guarantee that. You have some games that certainly Iowa can lose. And that's where
Right.
kind of I was going back and forth between 10-2 and 9-3. How many of those do they lose? But it's certainly, Iowa should be in the upper tier of the Big Ten once again, despite having no divisions. The Big Ten West was quite the gift this year for Iowa.
Yeah.
And you don't have that gift, but this is not a terrible schedule as things appear to be right now. So, yeah, I think 10-2, 9-3, certainly very realistic for the Hawkeyes in 2024.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with you. When I did this before we started filming, I had the same picks. I had my ceiling as 11-1. I can't see a way that they take down Ohio State, at Ohio State. My prediction was 10-2. I was tempted to go 9-3, but I think of the risky games, I think as long as Cade is just the quality quarterback that you were hoping for when you get him through the portal, and a receiver or two can step up, I feel like you can handle those games and go 10-2. But it's weird because my floor, this team of all the teams that I've really like taken a close look at this offseason has the biggest gap between the ceiling and the floor because there's so many games that if, like you said, the quarterback play or the offense just goes down the drain, that could go the other way. You see Iowa State could definitely go the other way. Maybe Washington, but they lose their entire offensive line. You replace Michael Penix with Will Rogers, who's solid, but he's not a dynamic game changer. Michigan State adds Jonathan Brooks and Aiden Childs, who could be an interesting quarterback. He looked pretty good at Oregon State. Wisconsin, like you said, is competitive. And Nebraska, if Dylan Raiola is what, those fans are hoping he is as a 5-star freshman, that could be interesting too. My floor, I can't decide between 7-5 and 6-6. I just feel like there's so much of a gap between the ceiling and the floor with this team, and that's kind of what makes them such an intriguing squad going into this next year. So it's gonna, all that is gonna be interesting. UCLA, coaching change and quarterback change. I'm not as fond of them.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it turns out. And so much of this, too, I think depends on what the offense looks like in 2024. They have a new offensive coordinator. How much does that change things?
Right.
How much?
Yeah, that too.
Because one of the kind of defenses that some people had for Brian Ferentz was, okay, well, how much of this is his offense versus Kirk's? We're about to find out how much of that is. And if they still have the same offensive issues, okay, you have some games there that could go the other way. You mentioned Nebraska. You can go down the list of ones that, okay, maybe could flip the other way. But if the offense clicks, I don't think you're really that concerned about the defense with how much experience they have coming back. Like this past defense was tremendous, and they didn't have that many returning starters. Like Jay Higgins was in his first year as a starting linebacker. So he was replacing Jack Campbell, and you thought, okay, how is Iowa going to replace Jack Campbell? Okay, well, Jay Higgins has a heck of a season in his first year as a starter, where he kind of instantly became that leader of the defense at that linebacker core. Of course, Dave Cooper-DeJean being the best player on the field. But you look at it and, okay, you've got a lot of defensive experience coming back. Special teams, you have Drew Stevens coming back at kicker, and Reese Dakin comes in at punter. Can't be another Torrey Taylor quite yet, you would think, but you never know. He could. So you could look down the list and see there are enough reasons for optimism. And also, if the offense doesn't click, reasons for pessimism as well.
Yeah. As far as, like I said before, 12-team playoffs, do you think 10-2 gets the squad into the playoffs? Or, let me rephrase, do you think that this team will get into the playoffs if you had to make a prediction right now?
I think it's possible. Certainly not a bet the house on it situation, but right. I think that's it's an optimistic goal, but I think it's an attainable one as well. Just when you look at this Iowa defense is certainly good enough for Iowa to be one of the top 12 teams. You look at the special teams, there's reason to believe they can be good enough that warrants top 12. And you give LeVar Woods a lot of benefit of the doubt, too, just how incredible of a job he's done with that unit. And then it goes down to the offense. And they've been ranked at points despite having a complete lack of offensive production. If you can get that offense to be just average, yeah, this could be a playoff team. If this offense looks like how it did in 2023 and 2022, that becomes a much more difficult argument. But I think it's something that Iowa fans can at least think about, and it's not totally out of the realm of possibilities. No, this has been a great discussion. Thanks for having me on. Sounds great.